Rain tapped against the carriage glass in a fine gray dust, and the smell of wet wool and old leather clung to Frances Vale's gloves as Wraywood Hall came into view through the bare trees. It was a handsome house still, broad-fronted and pale, but it had the look some grand places take on when they have been left too long with sorrow for company. The stone steps were green at the edges. The iron lamps had not been properly blacked. Even before she crossed the threshold, she felt the strange discipline of the place, as if every servant, every curtain, every door hinge had been taught to move softly for fear of disturbing the dead. A widowed governess hired into a grieving duke's embalmed household, where she steadies his motherless children and quiets the wolfhound he can no longer command, might have been excused for turning round then and there. Frances did not. She had lived through her own season of loss and learned a hard lesson from it. Grief could empty a room, yes, but it could also make a fool of the living if they let it rule the whole house. She stepped down from the carriage with her small trunk, her plain bonnet damp with mist, and looked steadily at the old steward who came to receive her. "Mrs. Vale," he said with a bow that was exact, though tired. "I am Mr. Briar. Welcome to Wraywood." His voice was courteous, but his eyes moved over her as if measuring whether she, too, would fail. Inside, the great hall smelled of beeswax, cold stone, and ashes long gone dead in the grates. The floor beneath her boots was clean, yet the air itself seemed untouched. There were veiled mirrors along the passage, white linen drawn over them like shrouds. On the mantel in the morning room stood 3 stopped clocks, all fixed to the same minute. When Frances paused before them, Mr. Briar answered the question she had not yet spoken. "Her Grace died at that hour, madam. His Grace wished time to remain there." He did not say childbed death. He did not need to. Crape, looped over the archway leading toward the upper nursery, told its own story. Frances was shown to a chamber in the east wing, neat but chill, with a narrow fire and a jug of hot water already cooling on the washstand. From her window she could see the yew walk, the stable roofs, and beyond them a walled garden gone to winter neglect. Somewhere in the house a child laughed very suddenly, then stopped, as if checked by an unseen hand. A moment later came another sound, deeper and rougher, the drag of chain over stone, followed by one heavy thud against a wooden door. Frances turned from the window. "What is kept there?" she asked. Mr. Briar hesitated. In houses like Wraywood, hesitation often told more truth than speech. If you enjoy stories like this, do subscribe and stay with me, because the next sound she heard answered the question before he did. Mr. Briar did not answer at once. He listened, as if judging whether the sound would come again and save him the trouble of naming it. Then he said, very quietly, "That is Bran, madam, His Grace's wolfhound." The chain scraped once more, followed by a low, chest-deep growl that seemed to travel through the stone itself. "You need not concern yourself with him. He is secured." Secured. It was one of those useful household words that often meant neglected. Frances said nothing to that. She removed her gloves finger by finger, laying them beside the wash basin, and turned when a maid arrived to conduct her to the children. The girl could not have been more than 17. Her apron was clean, though badly mended, and she kept twisting the corner of it as she walked. They passed along an upper passage where the air was colder than below, and where the smell changed from beeswax and ash to lavender gone stale in linen presses. At the far end hung a breadth of black crape over a carved archway. Beyond it lay the nursery rooms, or what had once been nursery rooms. The schoolroom had been moved out of that wing, Frances soon saw, and squeezed instead into a small morning parlor with faded wallpaper and narrow windows. There she found the children waiting at a table too large for them, their copybooks opened, their backs very straight. Julian rose the moment she entered. He was a grave little boy, dark-haired, with eyes older than his years. Eliza copied him a beat later, fair and slight and watchful, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles showed white. "Good afternoon," Frances said. "Good afternoon, ma'am," they answered together, like children drilled to correctness because no one had known what else to give them. There followed that first awkward quarter hour known to every governess and every child who has outlived one. Names were confirmed, ages, reading, writing, French begun and disliked, geography neglected. Frances asked simple questions and received neat, spare replies. The girl's gaze kept flicking to the door. The boy's attention did something more difficult. It weighed her. He had already learned, poor child, that adults made promises with bright voices and then vanished. When the tea tray came up, Eliza reached for the bread as if by habit, then stopped and looked toward the empty chair at the hearth. "May we?" she asked in a whisper. Frances followed her glance. No one sat there. The hearth was laid but cold. "Why should you not?" she said. The maid who had brought the tray nearly dropped the milk jug. Julian went still. Eliza withdrew her hand at once. The boy answered for them. "Nurse said nothing is to be taken in the old rooms, not since Mama went to heaven." There it was, plain at last. Rules had spread through the house like ivy, climbing over sense, over comfort, over hunger. Frances buttered a slice of bread herself and set it on Eliza's plate. "You are in this room," she said, "and children must eat where they are." Eliza looked to her brother, then obeyed. A small thing, you may think, bread and tea, but in houses ruled by grief, the smallest permission can sound almost like rebellion. The lesson ended before dusk. As Frances rose, Julian said, "Will you go away soon?" It was asked without softness. He wanted the answer clean. "No," she replied. "I have only just come." He gave one short nod, accepting the statement for what it was worth. Then, from somewhere beyond the black-draped archway, Bran let out a single bark, and Eliza's cup slipped in her hands and shattered on the floor. The cup broke with a thin, sharp sound, and for one strange second, nobody moved. The spilled tea ran across the table leg and darkened the faded carpet, while Eliza stared at the pieces as though she herself had done something wicked beyond repair. Frances bent at once. "Do not trouble yourself," she said. "Porcelain is not a soul. It may be broken and survive very well in memory." She took the child's cold hand, turned it palm upward, and checked for cuts before the maid had gathered her wits enough to fetch a cloth. Julian had gone pale, though whether from his sister's fright or from the bark beyond the crepe-hung passage, it was hard to say. Frances sent the maid for a dustpan, then set Eliza back in her chair and pressed the untouched slice of bread nearer. "You will finish your tea in another cup." The maid returned in a fluster, and behind her came a footman with a message spoken low into Mr. Breyer's ear. The steward, who had appeared at the disturbance with his usual air of careful composure, drew himself up another inch. "His Grace is in the house," he said, though none had asked. The servants shifted at once. Even the air in the room seemed to tighten. Frances noticed it with the interest of a sensible woman who has worked in great homes before. Affection may soften a household, but fear orders it very quickly. She did not meet the Duke in the schoolroom. She met his presence first in silence. As the children were led away to wash for supper, she walked alone through the upper corridor and felt, rather than heard, that someone had entered the long gallery below. There followed no cheerful exchange, no calling for lights, no sound of boots tossed off before a fire. A door opened, a door shut. Then nothing. Wraywood received its master the way a church receives a mourner who has come too often. Later, in the half-hour before dusk, Frances was shown the family dining parlor where the children were to take their evening meal. A place had been laid for her at one end of the table and two small settings opposite. no fourth setting. The silver was polished, but one candlestick leaned, and the room smelt faintly of extinguished coal. Through the tall windows she could see the west court filling with fog. Julian came in first, washed and brushed, his face closed again. Eliza followed, carrying a rag doll whose dress had once been blue. When they were seated, Frances said, "Will His Grace not dine with you?" Julian cut his boiled carrot into exact pieces before answering. "Papa does not come." "Does he never?" The child paused. Eliza looked down at her plate. "He came once," Julian said at last. "After—" He stopped, then tried again with painful care. "After my brother died with Mama. He stood by the hearth and looked at us, and Nurse cried, and Bran scratched the door, and Papa went away again." Frances had just lifted her fork when the door opened behind her. No servant had announced him, no one had dared. She turned, and there in the doorway stood the Duke of Wray, still in his dark coat, one hand on the latch, his face so worn by inward weather that for a moment he scarcely seemed a man entering his own room, but an apparition returned to inspect it. His eyes moved first to the children and then to Frances. For a moment nobody at the table seemed to breathe. The Duke was younger than Frances had expected, and older, too, in the way grief can alter a face before its proper time. His coat was damp at the shoulders from the fog outside. One glove remained crushed in his fingers. He seemed to have forgotten he still held it. He had the look of someone who had once moved easily through rooms like these, and now entered them as a stranger enters a church after years away. Julian rose so fast that his chair legs struck the floor. Eliza followed, clutching the rag doll to her chest. "Papa," she whispered. Owen Ashcombe inclined his head to the children first. He did not cross to them. His gaze went to Frances next, steady, tired, unreadable. "Mrs. Vale, I believe?" "Yes, Your Grace." There was a small pause. She saw him taking stock of her plain dress, her composed expression, the replaced teacup at Eliza's hand, the ordinary fact of a meal continuing where perhaps he had expected only silence and ritual. He said, "I had not understood that supper in this room had resumed." Frances answered with care, "The children must eat somewhere, sir." A lesser woman might have softened it with apology. Frances did not. The truth of the thing stood well enough on its own. Something changed in his face then, not offense exactly, though habit urged him toward it. Weariness won. He stepped into the room and placed the glove upon the mantel, beside a pair of silver candlesticks that wanted polishing. The movement was so slight, yet both children watched it as if he had lifted a banner. "I do not wish the old wing disturbed," he said. "Mr. Briar will have explained the household arrangements." "He has explained some of them," Frances replied. Those dark eyes returned to hers. He was a man much obeyed in the world outside, one guessed, and now unaccustomed to finding resistance in so quiet a form. "Then I will explain the rest. The children's lessons are in your charge. The house beyond that arch is not. The rooms there remain as they are. No alterations are to be made." Julian lowered his eyes. Eliza's fingers tightened on the doll. Frances noticed both things. She also noticed the fireless grate at Owen's back and the cold air creeping under the door. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, but inwardly she marked the distinction. He had spoken of rooms, not of children. He gave one curt nod and might have gone then, preserving the moment in its frost, had Bran not begun again. This time it was no single bark. It was a harsh, scraping tumult from the yard side of the house, chains striking wood, claws battering against some barrier, the sound of a creature strong enough to shake loose old fear from every servant within hearing. Eliza flinched. Julian's fork slipped from his hand. "And the Duke?" The Duke shut his eyes for the briefest instant, as if the noise had found the exact place where his composure was thinnest. Francis saw it. More importantly, so did the children. Then, from somewhere out in the passage beyond the dining parlor, there came another sound. A bell inside one of the stopped clocks, striking the forbidden hour. The sound was small, almost timid, and that made it stranger. One clear strike, then another. Not from the hall clock, nor from the dining room mantel where the hands had long ago been fixed, but from somewhere deeper in the passage, muffled by stone and distance. Owen turned at once. The children did the same. Mr. Briar, who had entered just in time to hear it, went the color of old paper. "No clock is to be wound in this corridor," the Duke said. His voice was low, but it carried through the room like cold water. He did not raise it. He did not need to. Mr. Briar bowed and went out immediately. A footman followed, then the frightened maid with her dust-cloth still in hand. In less than half a minute, the dining parlor had been reduced to the four who mattered, and the sound of Bran beyond the walls, no longer battering now, only pacing. Francis heard the drag and pause of the chain, the heavy turn of the beast, the rough exhale through his nose. No one touched a fork. At last Owen said, without looking at her, "You may continue supper, Mrs. Vale." "And you, Your Grace?" The question seemed to surprise him. Men long absent from family rooms are often startled by being included in simple arrangements. He glanced at the empty place settings, at the children's lifted faces, and then at the cold grate. "I had not intended to dine." Julian spoke before he could stop himself. "Will you stay now, Papa?" Silence followed. The boy's cheeks flushed at his own boldness. Eliza lowered her head over her doll, as if trying to make herself smaller than the request hanging in the room. Owen's hand tightened once on the back of the nearest chair. "No," he said after a moment, and the word came out tired rather than stern. "I cannot." He left then with the same measured step with which he had entered. That might have been easier to bear. Each movement was controlled, each one costing him. When the door shut, Eliza's lashes trembled. Julian reached for his spoon and missed it. Frances resumed her seat. "Your potatoes will be cold," she said. The children looked at her, startled. She cut a piece of mutton, tasted it, and reached for the salt, as though supper were still supper, and not another small heartbreak. After a moment, Julian copied her. Eliza took one obedient bite. Sometimes steadiness begins in such humble acts that no one would think to praise them. When the meal was over and the children had been sent upstairs, Frances did not return directly to her room. She went into the corridor where the air was colder and the candles burned low in their sconces. One of the veiled mirrors along the wall had been slightly disturbed, as though a passing sleeve had brushed it. Beyond it stood Mr. Briar, holding a brass key and looking very much like a man discovered in wrongdoing. At his feet, on a narrow side table, sat a small traveling clock. Its lid was open. Its hands were moving. Mr. Briar looked at the clock as though it had betrayed him. It was a small thing, brass-edged, with a cracked enamel face and a handle meant for travel. Nothing grand, nothing worthy of a ducal decree. Yet the tiny beat of it in that cold passage sounded almost indecent. Tick, 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 a living pulse where all the proper clocks had been sentenced to stillness. "I was only setting it right for the housekeeper's room," he said. "Mrs. Henshaw cannot manage the still room and the laundry by memory alone." Francis came nearer. His key glinted in the candlelight. "Then why bring it here?" A flush rose under the old man's collar. "Because I heard His Grace cross to the West Court and thought there would be time." There was something so weary in the confession that Frances did not press him at once. She looked down the passage where the veiled mirrors stood like waiting ghosts, then back at the little clock. She had seen households ruled by vanity, by extravagance, by drunkenness, by petty tyranny. This was something more sorrowful. Here even usefulness had become a secret practice. "And do the servants always hide time from their master?" she asked. Mr. Briar gave a short breath that was almost a laugh, though no amusement lay in it. "Bread rises when it rises, madam. Fevers turn when they please. Children wake hungry before dawn, whether grief allows it or no. Below stairs we keep what hours we must." He lowered his voice. "Above stairs we pretend." That answer stayed with Frances long after she returned to her chamber. The fire there had sunk to red eyes among the coals. Rain tapped faintly at the panes. Somewhere far off, Bran gave one restless bay and was silent again. She sat at the dressing table with her hair loosened and considered the shape of the house she had entered. The Duke had frozen time at the point of loss. The servants had learned to move around the ice. The children, worst used of all, had been expected to grow inside it. By morning she had formed the first of her decisions. She rang for hot water, dressed early, and went down before lessons to the nursery floor. The black crepe still hung over the arch. Dust lay along the molding where no honest cleaning had been done for months. The door to the old day nursery stood shut, though not locked. From beyond it came no sound of play, no nurse's bustle, no nursery rhyme half sung over buttons and soap. Only the empty stillness of unused rooms. Julian found her there. He carried his reading book under one arm, already buttoned into the day like a little clerk. "You are not meant to come here," he said quietly. "I have gathered that," Frances replied. He looked at the crepe, not at her. "Bran sleeps in the yard below this side. He used to lie outside that door." Used to. Frances turned that word over in her mind. "And now?" Julian hesitated. "Now he pulls at the chain when the bells ought to ring." Before she could answer, a furious crash sounded from below the window, followed by the scrape of iron over stone and a man's startled oath. Frances moved to the glass and looked down into the misty yard. 2 grooms were struggling to hold the Wolfhound back from the wall beneath the nursery rooms, and one of them had dropped the chain. Frances was already moving before the second groom shouted. The yard below the nursery windows was slick with morning damp, the cobbles dark as slate. Bran had not yet bolted free, but he was near enough to it. One length of chain trailed from his collar. The groom who had dropped it was pressed back against the wall with both hands up, as if fear alone might hold off that enormous body. The other man had seized the loose end, though badly, wrapping it twice about his wrist in a way that promised pain to one of them soon enough. "Stand away from him," Mr. Briar called from behind Frances as she came down the back stair. That was advice meant for a sensible world. In this one, the children's windows stood directly above the scene, and Bran's whole straining body was turned toward them. He was not snapping at the men. He was lunging upward, forepaws striking stone, whining between those deep, harsh barks as if trying to reach something beyond the wall itself. Frances stopped a few paces off and truly saw him for the first time. He was magnificent, even in disorder. Broad head, storm-gray coat thick with burrs and mud, ribs too plain beneath the fur, amber eyes shot through with distress. The raw patch under the collar looked angry and damp. This was no merely vicious beast. This was an animal half undone by confinement, grief, and mishandling. "Do not pull him so," she said. The groom stared at her as though she had lost her mind. "He'll be over us, ma'am." "He is over himself already." Her voice remained level. "Loosen your arm before he tears it from the socket." Perhaps it was her tone, or perhaps the man had no better plan left. He shifted his grip. Bran swung his head toward Frances at once. His chest heaved. Foam clung in white threads at the corners of his mouth. One ear was nicked. He stood with the chain clattering over the cobbles, deciding whether she belonged with the men who restrained him or with the rooms he could not reach. Julian had come to the window above. She felt rather than saw him there. Frances crouched slowly, gathering her skirts under her, lowering herself to something less challenging than a standing figure. "You know that side of the house," she said to the dog, as if naming a fact might steady it. "You have not forgotten." Bran gave a rough, broken sound in answer. Mr. Briar came closer in agitation. "Mrs. Vale, His Grace gave strict instructions regarding the hound." "And who feeds him?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the animal. The steward faltered. "The stable hands." "How often?" No answer came. There are moments when a household reveals itself more honestly than it means to. This was one of them. Frances could smell wet fur, old straw, and the sourness of a creature left too long in his own unrest. She rose at once and turned to the nearest maid lingering by the door. "Bring me cold beef, if there is any, and a basin of fresh water." Mr. Briar stared. "Madam, if he is to be kept here, he must at least be tended properly." The maid fled. The grooms looked scandalized. Bran never took his eyes from Frances. He had ceased lunging now. He stood listening. Then another voice cut across the yard, low and sharp enough to stop everyone where they were. "What do you imagine you are doing with my dog?" Owen had come down into the yard without hat or gloves, like he'd heard trouble and stepped into it before thought could catch up. The damp had darkened his hair at the temples. His gaze went first to Bran, then to the trailing chain, then to Frances, crouched on the cobbles with her skirts gathering wet at the hem. No one answered him at once. At length Frances said, "I imagine, Your Grace, that I am trying to prevent your dog from hurting himself." A groom made a sound deep in his throat, half scandal and half warning. "Mr." Briar shut his eyes for a brief second, as though bracing for impact. Owen's expression hardened, though whether from her words or from the sight of the raw skin beneath the collar, she could not yet tell. "He is dangerous when crossed," he said. "He is distressed when thwarted," she returned. "There is a difference." Bran's ears twitched at the low exchange. He had not taken his eyes from Frances. When the maid came hurrying with the basin and the plate of cold beef, trembling badly enough to spill water on the flags, the hound lunged one pace toward the food and checked himself. The chain rattled. Owen's jaw tightened. "Stand clear," he said to Frances, and this time his voice carried the old command in it, the kind men obey on instinct. She stayed put. She only extended her hand toward the maid and took the plate herself. "If I stand clear, he remains where he is. Mud, iron, and misery. Is that your wish for him?" The question landed harder than open defiance might have done. Owen stared at her. So did everyone else in the yard. You must understand, in houses like Wraywood, the true shocks are seldom loud. Often they are plain truths spoken in the place where everybody has agreed to live around them. Frances set one piece of beef on the stones within the dog's reach and withdrew her fingers. Bran lowered his head, nostrils working, but did not take it. His eyes flicked once to Owen. "Go on," she said softly to the beast. "No one is taking that from you." The dog waited. Owen made a movement, slight but visible, as though to step forward and reclaim the whole moment. Then he stopped. Something in Bran's watchfulness had arrested him. At last he said, more quietly, "He has not eaten well for some time." Frances turned her head enough to look at him. "Then let us begin there." 1 beat. 2. Bran took the meat. The sound of his jaws closing on that simple mouthful seemed to alter the air in the yard. The groom with the chain loosened his grip in surprise. The maid covered her lips with her apron. Even Julian, still at the nursery window above, leaned farther out. Francis placed a second piece down, and then a third, never hurrying him, never reaching to touch. Between each offering, Bran looked at her as if measuring a language he had almost forgotten. When at last she slid the basin nearer with the toe of her boot, he drank in long, rough pulls, water spilling silver from his muzzle onto the stones. Owen said nothing for so long that Mr. Briar shifted uneasily. Then the Duke spoke, not to Francis, but to the grooms. "Leave us." Both men stared. "Now." They withdrew at once. Mr. Briar followed, reluctant and grave. The yard emptied, save for the three of them, man, woman, hound. Rain began again, very fine, scarcely more than mist. Bran finished drinking and lifted his head. And then, with no warning at all, Francis saw Owen reach for the fallen chain himself. Francis's breath caught, though she did not show it. Owen bent slowly, every line of him wary, and closed his hand around the wet iron. Bran's head came up at once. The great dog did not spring. He did not cringe, either. He stood with his body tense and his eyes fixed on his master, as if the two of them had been brought to the same difficult threshold, and neither knew how to cross it. "Easy, Bran," Owen said. The words were plain, stripped of command. That, more than anything, told Francis how matters stood between them. Once, perhaps, the dog would have answered tone, whistle, gesture. Now he listened and trembled, and remained where he was, uncertain whether obedience would cost him the one thing he still sought, the rooms above. Owen tried to gather the chain. At the first scrape against the stones, Bran jerked back with such force that the links burned through the Duke's palm. Francis heard the sharp intake of breath he did not permit himself to voice. The dog gave a hoarse cry, twisted, and would have dragged free again had she not spoken at once. "Do not pull him from the window." Owen looked at her over his shoulder, his expression hard with pain and pride both. "He cannot remain here." "He is trying to tell you something." "He is a hound, Mrs. Vale." "Yes," she said, "and he remembers." Rain beaded on the dog's whiskers. His flanks worked. Above them, the nursery casement stood pale in the morning haze. Julian had withdrawn from view, but Francis knew the children were still there. Children always listen hardest when adults think they are absent. Owen straightened, the chain loose in his hand. "You speak as though you know the beast." "I know neglect when I see it." The words left her before softness could tame them. A groom at the far archway made the sign of the cross under his breath. Mr. Briar closed his eyes. Owen went very still. Francis might have regretted the bluntness with another man. With this one, she suspected politeness had done enough damage already. She lowered her voice. "Look at his neck, sir. Look at his ribs. Look where he keeps his watch. If he were merely savage, he would have gone for the man who lost the chain. He wants the nursery." For a long moment, Owen said nothing. Then, at last, he did look. Truly look. At the rubbed skin under the collar. At the muddy fur clotted behind the ears. At the water the beast had drained in desperate gulps. At the way Bran, even now, leaned not toward the gate or freedom, but toward the wall beneath the old nursery rooms. When Owen spoke again, his voice had altered. "He used to lie outside my wife's door." Francis answered gently. "And after she was gone?" "He would not leave the passage." The Duke's hand tightened on the chain. "The children heard him all night. The servants complained. I had him taken down." There it was, weariness making harsh work of love. Francis said, "Then let him serve where his instinct still points. Unchain him, tend him properly. If he chooses the threshold, let him keep it." Mr. Briar gave a faint, scandalized gasp. Owen stared at her as though she had proposed opening a tomb. Before he could answer, hoofbeats sounded under the arch. A rider had come fast through the front court. A moment later, a groom hurried in with a card on a silver tray, rain-spotted and urgent. "For His Grace," he said, "Mr. Silas Felgate has arrived, and he asks to see the children." The name changed the temperature of the yard more quickly than the rain. Owen's face shut at once. Whatever uncertain softness Bran had drawn from him a moment before was gone behind rank weariness and old family caution. He handed the chain to the groom without another word, though not before Francis saw blood bright along his palm where the iron had burned him. "Take the dog in," he said, "not to the yard. The loose box near the north arch, straw, fresh water, and send for salve." The order startled everyone, most of all the grooms. Bran resisted at first, straining once toward the nursery wall, but the edge had gone out of his frenzy. He went because Owen had ceased struggling with him, and because the meat and water had broken the worst of his panic. Francis watched the beast disappear under the arch and felt, strangely, that an argument had only been postponed. Mr. Briar offered the silver tray. Upon it lay a visiting card, damp at the corners, the ink beginning to feather. Owen glanced at it, then folded his fingers over it so sharply the pasteboard bent. "Show Mr. Felgate to the west morning room," he said. The steward hesitated. "He has asked whether the young lord and lady might join him for chocolate, Your Grace." "No." The answer came without heat. That made it firmer. Owen turned then to Francis, and for the first time since she had entered Wraywood, his attention rested on her not as an intrusion, but as a person standing in the midst of consequences. "Mrs. Vale, you will keep the children upstairs until I send word." "Very good, sir." His gaze dropped briefly to the wet hem of her dress, then to her bare hand, reddened from the cold basin water. "You may wish to change." "I may wish many things," Francis said, before prudence could stop her. A faint color touched his cheekbones, something nearer to reluctant recognition. But Mr. Felgate waited, and the moment passed. Owen inclined his head and went toward the house with that same controlled stride, leaving a dotting of rain on the flags behind him. By the time Frances had changed her shoes and set the children to copywork, the west morning room had taken on the tense, muffled life of a chamber where unwelcome politeness is being performed. That room stood one floor below the schoolroom, and though the doors were shut, old houses carry voices up stairwells and through vent grates. Enough. Julian bent over his slate with real effort. Eliza kept glancing toward the door every time a floorboard settled. "Write the line again," Frances told the boy gently. "Yes, ma'am." Below, a man's voice drifted upward, smooth, agreeable, almost tender in its concern. Silas Felgate, then. He spoke as those men do who mean to seem safe before they mean to be believed. Frances caught fragments only, deeply anxious for the children. "The county has begun to remark, 'Your health, dear cousin, is a matter of common sorrow.'" Julian's chalk snapped in his fingers. Frances came to his side at once. "Another piece will serve." He looked up at her with an expression far older than childhood should allow. "He always says 'dear cousin' like that," he murmured, "and afterward Papa shuts every door." That was new. Frances filed it away. The voices below lowered, sharpened, rose again. A chair moved. Then came a silence so complete that even Eliza stopped fidgeting. Into that hush sounded one clear thing from the floor beneath. Owen's voice, roughened past courtesy. "You will not speak of removing my children while I yet draw breath." And then someone else answered, calm as a knife laid on linen. "In that case, Owen, you had better prove it very soon." No child should hear such words spoken beneath his feet. Julian had gone white clear to the lips. Eliza looked from her brother to Frances, not understanding the whole of it perhaps, but understanding enough. Children always do. They know when grown people are speaking of separation, even when the language is wrapped in courtesy and law. Frances rose from the schoolroom table and crossed to the door before either child could ask the question, trembling between them. She did not go down. That would have been disobedience of the wrong kind, and useless besides. Instead, she closed the door firmly against the stairwell, shutting out the murmur below, and turned back to the children with the calm face of a woman who means to hold a room steady by force of will alone. "Julian," she said, "fetch the box of copy slips from the shelf. Eliza, bring your doll and sit by the window. We shall have lessons there." Julian did not move. "He means to take us away." The plainness of it pierced her more than tears might have done. She came to him and laid one hand on the broken chalk still in his fingers. "Mr. Felgate means many things. That does not make them accomplished facts. Papa never answers him." That, she suspected, was true enough to hurt. "Then your father must begin," she said. The boy searched her face as if testing whether she spoke from kindness or from certainty. He found no softness there beyond what he could trust. At length he nodded once and went to the shelf. Eliza climbed obediently to the window seat with her doll in her lap, though she kept pressing her cheek against the glass as if she might see through walls. Frances set them to work, not because nouns and penmanship mattered more than family danger, but because frightened children require occupation the way chilled hands require warmth. Idleness invites terror to sit down and make itself master. She had Julian copy a page in his neatest hand. She showed Eliza how to fold paper into little packets for button sorting, then filled them with dried peas from the work-basket. Small tasks, measured tasks, the kind by which a shaken morning may be made to pass 1/4 hour at a time. Below, the voices went on, muffled now. Once there came the ring of a handbell, once the scrape of a chair. Once, unmistakably, Mr. Felgate's low, cultivated laugh, so smooth and confident that Frances felt her own hands grow cold. At last the door opened a crack, and Mr. Briar entered. He looked 10 years older than he had the day before. In one hand he carried a note on folded paper, in the other a salve jar. "For Mrs. Vale," he said quietly. "His Grace asks that you see to the dog's neck if you are willing. The groom reports Bran will take food from no one else." Julian looked up at that. Eliza slid from the window seat at once. "And His Grace?" Frances asked. Mr. Briar hesitated. "Still with Mr. Felgate, madam." She took the salve and note. The paper held only a few words in Owen's hand, pressed harder than was needful into the page. "Do what you can for him. Keep the children upstairs." No signature, no flourish, only urgency. Frances folded the note and put it into her pocket. Then she saw, on the cuff of Mr. Briar's sleeve, a smear of sealing wax not yet fully hardened, black wax, marked by a signet she did not know. And suddenly she understood that Mr. Felgate had not come merely to threaten. He had come prepared to set something in motion that very day. Frances left the children with their copy slips, the schoolroom maid, and very strict instructions that no one was to admit visitors. Julian opened his mouth as if to object, then thought better of it. Eliza only clutched her doll and asked, "Will Bran bite you?" "No," Frances said, taking up the little salve jar. "He has had quite enough of biting from the world." The north arch stable was warmer than the yard, though it smelt strongly of damp straw, horse sweat, and old leather harness. Bran had been put into the loose box alone. Someone had thrown down fresh bedding and set a bucket just inside the door, but none had gone farther. The groom stood well back, relieved to surrender both duty and danger at once. When Frances entered, she saw the hound lying near the wall, head up, ears sharp, one forepaw stretched before him like a sentry's. He had eaten the remaining beef, but not settled. His eyes followed every sound beyond the stable door. She did not go directly to him. She placed the salve on an upturned grain bucket, drew another nearer, and sat. That simple act altered the room. Animals know when a person means to seize and when she means to remain. Bran watched her, chest rising slow and deep. Once he gave a low, warning rumble. Frances answered it with silence, then with ordinary speech, the sort used over sewing or soup. "You have been badly handled," she said. "That much is plain. We shall not improve matters by pretending otherwise." She let him hear her voice while she poured clean water from the pail into a shallow pan and set it within his reach. He came to it after a time, drinking without taking his eyes from her. Only when he had done did she dip 2 fingers into the salve and hold out her hand for him to smell. The sharp scent of camphor and herbs rose between them. Bran sniffed, sneezed once, and looked offended by medicine in principle. Frances almost smiled. "Very good," she murmured. "Dislike it if you must." An hour may pass differently in a stable than in a drawing room. There was no grand taming, no miracle of instant trust. There was waiting, breath, patience, and the gradual exchange of permission. At last, Bran allowed her hand to touch the fur below his ear. It was coarse with dried mud. When her fingers reached the raw strip beneath the collar, the beast flinched so sharply that she withdrew at once. "Easy," she said. I know. He did not snap. After a few moments, he lowered his head again, and she worked with the lightest touch she possessed, easing the salve along the chafed skin little by little. Outside, carriage wheels ground over gravel, then rolled away. Somewhere farther down the stable row, a horse stamped. Wraywood, for all its arrested rooms and stopped clocks, still had to move on hoof and hinge and hungry mouths. Even grief cannot keep an estate entirely still. When she emerged at last, Mr. Briar was waiting beneath the arch with a face more troubled than before. "Madam," he said, "Mr. Felgate has gone, but not before leaving papers with His Grace. Formal papers." Frances wiped her hands on a rag and looked at him steadily. "What sort of papers?" The old steward swallowed. "A petition, madam, to have the Duke declared unfit, and the children placed under other protection." At that very moment, from the corridor above them, there came the brittle crash of breaking glass. Frances was halfway to the stair before Mr. Briar had finished speaking. The crash had come from the upper corridor outside the schoolroom, followed by a maid's frightened cry and then silence, which was worse. She reached the landing to find the door flung wide, the copy slips scattered, and Eliza standing very still in the midst of glittering fragments. One of the veiled mirrors in the passage had been knocked from its narrow table. The linen cloth had slipped aside. A jagged corner of glass reflected candlelight in crooked shards. Julian stood between his sister and the broken frame, breathing hard. "I told her not to look," he said, though his voice was pitched strangely, as if he were defending himself against something larger than the accident. Eliza's lower lip trembled. "I only wanted to see if Mama was there." That struck the room silent. The maid who had been set to watch them was in tears already, wringing her hands over the ruined mirror as though 7 years' bad luck were the chief matter at stake. Frances knelt at once before Eliza, checking shoes, stockings, small shaking hands. No cuts. Julian had dragged his sister back in time. She looked up at him. "You did well," she said simply. He swallowed and looked away. Frances rose and turned to the maid. "Take up the larger pieces, carefully, then fetch a broom and another cloth. No one is to speak nonsense over broken glass in front of these children." The girl bobbed and fled. Eliza still stared at the exposed silvering within the fallen frame. "Nurse said mirrors keep the dead from straying," she whispered. "If they are covered, they sleep." Frances felt a cold anger then, Not at the child, but at the grotesque pieties grief had been allowed to breed in this house. She drew Eliza close, not with display, but with the competent closeness of someone fastening a cloak. "Your mother does not live in a piece of looking-glass," she said, "nor can a cloth command heaven." Julian lifted his eyes at that. Children listen very carefully when a grown person declines to tremble before nonsense. Below them, a door opened somewhere on the lower floor. Steps crossed the hall. The interview with Felgate had ended. Frances had no desire for the children to meet the cousin in this state, half frightened and standing beside a mirror unveiled by accident. She moved quickly. "Into the schoolroom, both of you." They obeyed. Once inside, she closed the door, drew the curtains against the corridor windows, and put the children to work with the task nearest to hand. Julian was given the books to stack by size. Eliza was told to sort her button packets again, red in one pile, white in another. Order first, questions after. Only when their hands were engaged did Frances unfold the paper Owen had sent and read it a second time. "Do what you can for him. Keep the children upstairs." The words had the haste of a man fighting battle on two fronts at once. Bran below, Felgate within. A measured tread sounded outside the schoolroom. Not a servant's or Mr. Briar's. The steps paused by the door, then moved on, stopping next at the threshold of the shrouded nursery wing. Julian's face changed. "That is Papa," he said. Then, after one taut beat, another voice spoke in the passage, smooth, patient, intolerably sure of itself. "No, my dear boy," said Mr. Felgate through the partly opened outer door. "It is your future." Frances crossed the schoolroom before either child could reach the handle. She opened the door herself and stepped into the passage, closing it behind her with a firmness that left no gap for little ears. Mr. Felgate stood a few yards away beside the disturbed arch of the nursery corridor, one gloved hand resting lightly on the back of a chair that had been left there by some fleeing servant. He was a handsome man, in the polished way certain dangerous men are handsome. His mourning black was cut better than Owen's. His linen was fresh. Even his sympathy looked laundered. He bowed. "Mrs. Vale, I think. I had hoped to reassure my young cousins." "You had been told they were not receiving callers." His smile deepened, though not with warmth. "My concern for them is familial. I do not think one needs stand upon strict forms where children are involved." "That depends," Frances said, "on what one means to do with them." The glance he gave her then was quick and measuring. He had expected pliancy, perhaps, or fear, or at the very least the eager civility often shown to wealth by those employed under it. What he found was a widow in a plain dress standing between him and his object, with no social ambition to bribe and no nerves available for his use. "My dear madam," he said gently, "I see you have been drawn into the household atmosphere. It can distort appearances. I seek only their welfare." "And the estate," said Frances. He did not answer that at once. Instead, he let his gaze drift to the crape still drooping over the nursery arch, to the fallen mirror table not yet righted, to the long corridor where every decorative clock stood frozen. "Can you deny the children are being reared in conditions unfavorable to healthy development?" "No," said Frances. "I should deny only that you are the physician required." A faint click sounded behind them. Owen had come into the passage without her hearing him. He looked as he had in the yard after the chain cut his palm, drawn taut by effort, held together by pride and necessity, and one insult away from collapse or fury. In his unwounded hand he carried a packet of folded papers. "Felgate," he said, "you have outstayed your welcome." Felgate turned with the patience of one who preferred witnesses when virtue was being performed. "I regret that your present state makes every duty appear hostile." "My state," said Owen, "does not include deafness. You were asked to leave." The cousin's eyes moved to the papers in Owen's hand. "Then you have read them?" Francis saw the muscle jump once in the Duke's jaw. Julian, behind the closed schoolroom door, had said his father never answered. She wondered whether Owen even knew how to begin answering such a thing now, with his house in mourning rags and his children listening through wood. Felgate lowered his voice, though not enough. "For your sake and theirs, do not force a public hearing. Withdraw quietly. Appoint proper guardians. Retire where you may indulge your sorrow without damaging the succession." It was a monstrous sentence, and all the worse for its soft cloth wrapping. Owen stepped forward. "You mistake me, cousin." For one heartbeat, Francis thought he meant to challenge, to rage, to do something useless and therefore satisfying. Instead, he held out the packet. "Mrs. Vale," said Owen, not taking his eyes from Felgate, "since my cousin is so anxious for the welfare of my household, perhaps you would be good enough to hear what, precisely, he has accused me of." And he placed the petition in her hands. The paper was thick and cold from his hand. Francis did not unfold it at once. She looked first at Owen. There are moments when reading a document becomes an act of witness, and this was one. His face had gone pale in that peculiar way which comes not from fear alone, but from humiliation sharpened by truth. Felgate's eyes rested on them both with maddening serenity, like he'd arranged the scene carefully and found it proceeding to his satisfaction. "Read it, madam," he said. "I have nothing to conceal." "That is seldom a recommendation," Francis replied. She opened the petition. The language was legal, dry, and more brutal for being so. It spoke of prolonged incapacity, of neglect of estate responsibilities, of children maintained in an atmosphere injurious to body and mind, of servants left without proper governance, of a duke who, following the death of his lady and infant son, had become unequal to the ordinary duties of rank, guardianship, and judgment. Each point was set down with elegant restraint, and each was designed to look less like malice than necessity. Francis read steadily to the end. She noted the seals, the names, a physician to be consulted, trustees to consider the matter, time allowed for response. She folded the sheets again with great care. "Well," said Felgate softly. "Well," said Francis, "if you wished to appear a vulture, you might at least have had the honesty to arrive without gloves." A flush rose in his cheeks at last. Very little, but enough. Owen's head turned sharply toward her. It was the first flicker of life she had seen in him all morning that was not pain. Felgate recovered himself almost at once. "You mistake solicitude for appetite, Mrs. Vale." "No, I mistake nothing." She held out the papers to Owen, but spoke to Felgate. "You have listed the signs of a house left in grief and called them proof that you deserve its children. My concern is lawful. Your concern is convenient." Owen took the petition back, though his fingers brushed hers only briefly. Even through that slight contact, she felt the strain in him, taut as wire drawn too far. Felgate shifted tactics. Men like him always do. "Cousin," he said, turning his voice grave and almost affectionate, "I gave you private warning. You know the state of things here. Look about you. The stopped clocks, the covered glasses, the black drapery before rooms no child should fear to enter. If you contest this, those matters will be spoken of publicly. Is that what you wish for your son and daughter?" The words landed. Francis saw it. Owen's shoulders tightened, and for a dangerous instant he seemed to retreat inward again, toward that old frozen country where every accusation sounded deserved and every effort too late. From behind the schoolroom door came the faint scrape of a chair leg. The children were listening. Francis stepped closer to Owen, not touching him, only placing herself where he must see her if he looked away from Felgate. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "he is counting on your shame to answer for you." Felgate's mouth hardened. Owen did look at her then, really look. Not at an employee, not at an interloper in his mourning, but at the one person in the corridor who was not pretending this blow had fallen from heaven. And from somewhere below, sudden and deep enough to shake the stair rail, Bran began to bark. The barking rolled up through the floorboards again, heavy and urgent, and this time it did what argument had not. It broke the stillness that Felgate had been using as a weapon. He looked faintly annoyed. Owen did not. Something in that sound seemed to call him back from the edge to which shame had driven him. His hand closed over the petition, holding it. "Mr. Briar," he said, and his voice, though roughened, had recovered its shape. "See my cousin to his carriage." Felgate gave a small, incredulous laugh. "You dismiss me as though this were a social inconvenience. These papers have been lodged. You may delay, but you cannot silence them." "No," Owen answered, "but I may silence you in my corridor." The steward stepped forward at once. It was remarkable how quickly servants grow brave when authority ceases apologizing for itself. Felgate's expression cooled. He bowed to Francis first, because he was that sort of man, and then to Owen. "You have very little time," he said. "I advise you to spend it less romantically than you have spent the last 2 years." The insult was deliberate. Francis saw it land. She also saw Owen refuse, by effort, to answer it. That refusal cost him more than anger would have done. Felgate turned and went, his polished boots making no more sound than if he had left a church after profitable prayer. Mr. Briar followed him down. For a few seconds the corridor held only Francis, Owen, the shut schoolroom door, and Bran's deep voice below stairs. Owen did not look at her. He was staring at the nursery arch, at the black crape disturbed by Felgate's shoulder as he passed. "Every word in that petition can be proved," he said at last. "The clocks, the mirrors, the rooms, my absence from the estate, the children's isolation." He let out a breath that had no steadiness in it. "I have furnished him with his case." Francis answered quietly. "You have furnished him with facts. You need not furnish him with victory." He turned then. There was no defense left in his face, only exhaustion and something more dangerous. The temptation to surrender because surrender resembles relief when one has been struggling too long. "You do not understand," he said. "If this proceeds, strangers will come. They will examine the house, question the servants, observe the children, note every foolish ritual of grief I allowed to take root here, and they will do so under color of concern. Julian will hear himself discussed as succession. Eliza will hear herself discussed as placement. Bran—" He broke off, as if ashamed to have included the dog among the losses. "Then do not wait for strangers," Francis said. He frowned, not following. "Look at the house before they do. Name what is wrong before your enemies name it for you." She glanced toward the schoolroom door. "Your children have already begun." At that his gaze shifted. He had heard the mirror crash. He had perhaps guessed the rest. "Were they frightened?" "Yes." The answer was plain and immediate. She offered him no cushion. Owen closed his eyes briefly. "I cannot undo 2 years in a day." "No," said Francis, "but you can wind 1 clock." The sentence hung between them. Simple, practical, almost absurd beside the grandeur of ruin and petition and title. Yet she saw, in the smallest change of his expression, that it had reached him where larger exhortation would not. From inside the schoolroom came Eliza's little voice, muffled but clear. "Papa?" Owen's eyes opened. Then, from below, Bran stopped barking all at once and began to howl. The sound rose through the house like grief given a voice at last. It was not the furious barking of the yard, nor the frustrated battering of chain on stone. This was longer, rougher, almost human in its desolation. Eliza whimpered within the schoolroom. Julian said nothing at all. Owen stood motionless for one held second, and Francis saw with perfect clarity that the howl had struck the same hidden place in man and beast alike. Then he moved. He opened the schoolroom door himself. The children were standing close together by the table, copy slips forgotten, buttons spilled, both faces turned toward him with that wary yearning only neglected children possess. Owen paused on the threshold, as if uncertain of his own right to enter. It is a painful thing to see a father hesitate before his own children. More painful still when the children notice. "Eliza," he said, and his voice nearly failed him on her name. "Julian." The little girl ran to him before fear or custom could stop her. She caught at his coat with both hands and buried her face in the dark cloth. Owen stiffened in sheer surprise. Then, slowly, awkwardly, he laid one hand upon her hair. Julian did not move from his place, but his eyes filled so suddenly that he turned away toward the window. "I heard Mr. Felgate," he said. Owen closed his eyes briefly. "You should not have." "But I did." The boy faced him again. "Will he take us?" There are no polite ways through certain questions. Frances stayed where she was, saying nothing, because this answer had to be the Duke's, or it would not matter. Owen looked from his son to his daughter, then toward the corridor where the black-draped arch still stood like a wound left open in the house. "No," he said at last. Julian did not relax. He had learned too well the difference between desire and certainty. Owen heard it in the silence and straightened as though some internal vertebra had been set in place. "No," he repeated, stronger now. "He will not take you. Do you understand me?" This time the boy nodded. Below them, Bran howled again. Frances stepped forward. "He is calling from the north box, sir. He has been moved under cover, but he is not settled." Owen glanced at her, then at Eliza, still holding his coat. "He used to sleep outside the old nursery." "Yes." "And you would have him there again?" "I would have him where his instinct points." She kept her tone even. "And where the children may learn that not every memory need be chained in a yard." A dangerous stillness passed over his face. Thought, this time. Resistance meeting sense and finding itself tired. He looked at Julian. "Would you be afraid if Bran were brought upstairs?" The boy swallowed. "Not if Mrs. Vale is there." It was the simplest possible vote of confidence, and perhaps for that reason it touched more deeply than any speech could have done. Owen's mouth changed only a little, as though he had nearly remembered what smiling felt like. "Very well," he said. He turned toward the corridor, then stopped by the small side table where the broken mirror had been cleared away. Beside it still stood the little traveling clock Mr. Briar had meant to hide. Its hands were moving. Owen stared at it, and Frances, watching him, saw that he had come at last to the first of the choices she had set before him. His wounded hand lifted, and for the first time in 2 years, the Duke of Wray reached toward time instead of away from it. His fingers hovered over the little clock for one suspended moment, as if even that modest tick accused him. Then he took it up. The children watched in perfect silence. Frances did not speak. There are instances in a house such as Wraywood when words only get in the way of courage. Owen turned the small brass case in his hand, listening to its pulse. Not grand enough for a drawing room, not solemn enough for morning ritual, it had nonetheless become the first honest keeper of hours in the upper part of the house. He looked at Julian. "This was hidden from me," he said. The boy answered with painful truth. "Everyone hides things from you, Papa." No child means cruelty when he tells the truth plainly. That is why it cuts so deep. Owen took the blow without flinching outwardly, though Francis saw it travel through him. He set the clock carefully upon the little table again, no longer as contraband, but in plain sight. "Then let this remain," he said. It was a small decree. It felt larger than many noble pronouncements. Below, Bran's howl broke off into restless movement. Francis could hear claws against boards, a heavy turn of the body, another impatient cry. Owen heard it too. He glanced toward the stair. "Bring him up," he said to Mr. Briar, who had just returned, breathless, from seeing Felgate out. The steward stared. "To this floor, Your Grace?" "Yes." Mr. Briar, poor man, had lived too long in the habit of preserving decay to understand recovery when first it entered a room. "But the old arrangements are altered," said Owen. That settled it. The steward bowed and departed at once, though not without one bewildered look at the visible clock. Francis saw the children register the exchange. Children know authority by whether it repeats itself. She crossed to the fallen mirror table in the corridor and righted it herself. The broken glass had been swept, but the white cloth still hung half off the frame where Eliza had caught it. Francis folded the linen and laid it aside. The exposed mirror beneath, though cracked along one lower corner, still reflected the corridor, the black crape over the nursery arch, the Duke, the children, and herself standing among them all. No thunder followed. No curse dropped from heaven. Eliza stared. "Must it stay uncovered?" "For now," said Francis. Owen said nothing, yet he did not order the cloth replaced. A minute later came the slow tread of men on the stair and the scrape of hesitation at the landing. Bran appeared between two grooms, not struggling now, but straining forward with enormous concentration, nose lifted, body taut with memory. The corridor changed around him. Even the air seemed to wait. "Leave him," said Owen. The grooms let go and backed away at once. Bran stood free. He looked first at Owen, then at Francis. Then, with a low, aching sound deep in his chest, he turned toward the nursery passage and moved down it in 3 great silent steps. At the archway draped in black crape, he paused only to thrust his muzzle beneath the hanging folds. Then, with one savage shake of his head, the cloth tore loose from its fastening and slithered down across his back to the floor. No one moved. The dog stepped over it, came to the closed nursery door, and lay down across the threshold, as if he had merely returned to a duty interrupted yesterday, instead of 2 years ago. And from the far side of that door, muffled by wood and distance, there came a sound none of them had heard in a very long time. A clock within the old nursery, beginning faintly to strike. The faint striking went on behind the nursery door, thin, uncertain, but unmistakable. One stroke, then another. Eliza pressed close against Francis's skirts. Julian stood very straight, as boys do when they are frightened and determined not to show it. Bran did not move from the threshold. He lay there with his great head lifted, ears forward, as if he had been waiting these many months for someone else to hear what he had never ceased hearing. Owen stepped toward the door and stopped with his hand on the latch. The corridor had gone so still that Francis could hear the tiny working of the little traveling clock behind them, and, beneath that, the Duke's breath. He had forbidden this room to the living for 2 years. Now the house itself had answered him. "Papa?" Julian said quietly. That decided it. Owen opened the door. The nursery air came out cold and stale, touched with lavender, dust, and the faint bitter scent of old extinguished coals. Morning light from the tall windows showed a room kept half as shrine and half as abandonment. Black ribbons still hung from the bedposts. A cradle stood in the inner alcove under a cover gone gray with neglect. Toys had been put away too neatly, as if order might prevent grief from spreading. On the mantel sat the little nursery clock, its hands long fixed at the death hour. Yet now its works had shaken loose enough to strike weakly, protesting its own imprisonment. Frances did not let the children rush in. She kept one hand on each small shoulder and watched Owen take 3 steps into the room. He looked not at the cradle first, but at the cold grate, then at the little clock, then at the chair beside the hearth where someone had left a folded shawl and never returned for it. Bran rose, crossed the threshold past him, and went straight to the hearthstone. There he circled once and lay down with a long, trembling sigh, placing his muzzle between his paws as if resuming a vigil interrupted by human folly. Owen reached for the mantel clock. His wounded hand shook. He steadied it with the other and stared at the fixed hands. "It stopped that night," he said, though no one had asked. "I remember hearing it wind down, well." He did not finish. Frances answered softly, "Then let it begin somewhere else." He looked at her over the little clock in his hands. There was pain in his face, certainly, but something else with it now. He was far from peace. Choice, perhaps, the first hard outline of it. "Mr. Briar," he said without turning, "have this room aired. Open the windows an inch. Remove the damaged draperies." He swallowed once. "Not the cradle." "Not yet." "Yes, Your Grace," came the steward's hushed reply from the corridor. Julian made a small sound that was almost disbelief. Eliza whispered, "May Bran stay?" Owen glanced at the hound by the hearth. "Yes." He set the nursery clock gently on the mantel again, unfixed now, though not fully mended. A beginning, no more. Then he turned as footsteps hurried up the stair. A footman appeared, flushed from climbing, carrying a salver with a sealed note upon it. "For His Grace, sir, brought express." Owen broke the seal where he stood. Frances watched the color leave his face as he read. "What is it?" she asked. He lifted his eyes to hers. "They mean to send a physician," he said, "and an examiner from the trustees, day after tomorrow." The note altered everything because it gave grief a deadline. Until then, Wraywood's sorrow had been diffuse, like fog over the grounds, entering under every door and softening every outline. Now it had a date, a purpose, and a pair of eyes coming to judge it. That, strange as it may sound, helped. Indefinite misery can paralyze a house. A fixed hour compels it to move. Owen folded the paper once and put it in his pocket. "Day after tomorrow," he repeated, as if testing whether the words could be borne aloud. He looked around the nursery, at the dusty ribbons, the stale flowers, the unlit grate, Bran stretched by the hearth, and his children standing in the doorway. "Very well, then we have work." Julian blinked. Eliza clutched her doll tighter. Frances saw the moment strike them all at once. Their father was speaking as if the future existed. Mr. Briar, recovering his steadiness by degrees, said, "What are your orders, sir?" "Open the upper rooms that are fit to use, air them, remove the mourning from the nursery passage." Owen's voice roughened but held. "Not all at once, only what is torn or dust-clogged. We are not staging a mask of cheerfulness." He turned to Frances. "Mrs. Vale, you said I must name what is wrong before others do it for me. Begin." The trust in that request was abrupt and practical. It touched her more than a polished compliment would have done. She answered at once. "The children require a settled routine that can be witnessed. Meals, lessons, exercise, sleep.
The schoolroom must be orderly, their clothing mended where needed, the nursery aired but not stripped bare.
The servants must cease whispering before them. And the dog, she looked at Bran, who thumped his tail once against the hearthstone without lifting his head. The dog stays where he is useful. Owen gave the smallest nod. So be it. The next hours moved with the purposeful disorder of a long-neglected machine being set in motion. Windows were opened a finger's width against the cold. Rugs were beaten. Fresh linen came up from the presses, smelling of starch and lavender. The black crepe torn by Bran was removed from the floor and carried away, though one strip remained pinned higher along the far arch, awaiting a courage not yet reached. Francis oversaw the children's dinner tray in the schoolroom, had Julian's cuff sewn properly, washed soot from Eliza's hands, and set copybooks straight while servants hurried in and out under Mr. Brier's instructions. Owen did not retire. That alone astonished the house more than any order. He went downstairs to the estate room and had ledgers brought up from the cabinets. Later he crossed the gallery with a lamp and stood before one of the great still clocks in the family morning room, the one beneath a portrait of his grandfather. Francis, passing with folded napkins, saw him there with the brass winding key in his hand. He had not yet touched it. She might have gone on. Instead, she stopped in the doorway. "You need not do every hour at once," she said. "No." He gave a tired half-breath that was almost a smile. "Only one." He inserted the key. The metal rasped faintly. Once, twice, 3 turns. Then came the low internal catch, and after it, the first measured tick of that clock in 2 years. Owen closed his eyes at the sound. Before either of them could speak, hurried steps came from the stairs. A housemaid, flushed and breathless, dropped a curtsy and blurted, "Beg pardon, Your Grace. The physician has come early. He is here now with the trustees' man." No one in the room had the leisure to be shocked for long. Owen set down the winding key with care, as if haste itself might make him appear guilty. That small act mattered. A flurried man looks half defeated before any question is asked of him. A steady one compels others to wait upon his answers. "Where are they?" he said. "In the drawing-room below, sir," the maid replied. "Dr. Marden and Mr. Gresham of the trustees." Francis saw the children look at one another. Julian had gone into that grave stillness which was becoming too familiar. Eliza pressed her doll to her mouth and watched her father with round, anxious eyes. Bran, hearing the disturbance in human voices, rose from before the nursery hearth and came to stand in the doorway behind them all, tall and silent as winter. Owen looked first at Francis. "Will you keep the children here?" She answered, "I shall keep them ready." His gaze held hers for 1 second longer than custom required. Then he nodded and went out. You may think examinations of this kind are conducted in great solemn chambers with law books and clerks and thunderous declarations. Often they begin in a drawing room that smells faintly of damp coal and furniture polish, with a physician warming his hands at a fire someone has only just remembered to light. Power arrives by ordinary means more often than by theatrical ones. Francis did not immediately shut the schoolroom door after Owen. She crossed to the nursery instead and drew the inner windows wider by an inch, letting in a thread of cold air clean with rain. Mr. Brier had servants stripping away the most dust-laden ribbons. Somewhere nearby, a broom whispered over boards. The house was learning to move under pressure. "Mrs. Vale," Julian said quietly, "will they ask if Papa is mad?" "No." That was not true, perhaps, in the strictest sense, but accuracy is not always the first duty owed to frightened children. "They will ask whether he can govern his house," she said, "and he can." Eliza looked toward the open door. "How do you know?" Frances bent and straightened the child's collar. "Because he has begun." Below, voices murmured, then sharpened. The rhythm of adult scrutiny is unmistakable once you have heard it a few times. Question, pause, reply. Another question, phrased more smoothly than the first. Frances moved to the corridor, where the cracked mirror still stood uncovered and the small traveling clock ticked on the side table with a persistence almost insolent. She listened without leaning, without seeming to listen at all. Owen's voice carried up once, controlled, formal, too formal. Dr. Marden answered in the patient tone of one who believes himself humane while making notes that may damage a life. Then came another voice, thinner and more nasal. Mr. Gresham, no doubt. "And the children, Your Grace. Their present accommodation is unusual, I think?" Frances felt Julian come to stand beside her. He had heard that much, too. Before she could send him back, footsteps sounded on the stair, and Mr. Briar appeared, pale but composed. "Mrs. Vale," he murmured, "His Grace requests that the young lord and lady be brought down." Julian stiffened. Eliza made a tiny, frightened sound. Frances looked past the steward toward the lower hall. "For what purpose?" Mr. Briar hesitated. That was answer enough. "They wish to see," he said, "whether the children know their father." For the briefest instant, nobody spoke. Questions put to children by strangers can do more harm than open cruelty, because they teach the child to mistrust his own heart. Frances knew it, Mr. Briar knew it, Julian certainly knew it, though he had not the language for such knowledge. Eliza only understood that she was being summoned to a room where serious men wished to look at her and decide something. Frances crouched before them both. "You are not being sent to answer for anyone," she said. "You are only to speak truthfully and to remember that you are at home." Julian's face was pale but steady. "If they ask whether I know Papa, I do." "And if they ask whether he knows you?" Frances asked quietly. The boy's mouth trembled once, then firmed. "He is learning." That near undid her. Eliza clung to her doll. "May Bran come?" Frances glanced toward the nursery doorway. The great hound stood there watchful, his head level with her shoulder when she rose. "No," she said softly, "but he will remain where he belongs." She led the children down herself. The stair rail was cold under her palm, polished smooth by generations of hands. Below, the drawing-room doors stood open. A fire had been lit hastily there, and the smell of singed dust from a hearth too long neglected mingled with lamp oil and wet greatcoats. Dr. Marden was a spare, silver-whiskered man with gentle manners and an examining eye. Mr. Gresham was heavier, with pale lashes and the look of one who preferred papers to people because papers could not cry. Owen stood by the mantel, not lounging against it, not collapsed into a chair, but standing. That mattered. When the children entered, both gentlemen turned. Julian stiffened at once. Eliza half hid behind Frances's skirt until Owen said, with formal effort, "Come here, my dears." She did not run this time. She walked to him. Julian followed more slowly. Dr. Marden watched their faces. Mr. Gresham watched Owen's. The physician bent a little, kindly enough on the surface. "And do you know this gentleman?" Julian answered before anyone could soften the insult. "He is my father." Mr. Gresham cleared his throat. "And does His Grace commonly sit with you at lessons? Attend your meals? Inquire after your progress?" There it was, a ledger line. Julian looked at Owen. Frances saw the battle in the boy's face, loyalty against honesty, hunger against habit. Before he could force out a reply, Eliza spoke from the clear country of childhood. "He came today," she said. Mr. Gresham's brows shifted. Dr. Marden tried again. "Today. I see. And before that? Owen's hand clenched once at his side. Francis felt the whole room tilt toward danger. If the children were pressed to recite absence, the case would right itself. Then, from the hallway beyond, came a steady, audible tick. Everyone heard it. Mr. Gresham turned his head toward the sound. So did Dr. Marden. Owen did not move, but his voice, when he spoke, was firmer than it had yet been in their presence. "Before you ask my children to account for my failures," he said, "gentlemen, perhaps you will come and see what I have begun to set right." And he walked out of the drawing-room toward the upper corridor, expecting them to follow. They followed him because he gave them no graceful way to refuse. Dr. Marden came first, his medical bag still in hand. Mr. Gresham followed with the cautious dignity of one unaccustomed to climbing into the heart of another family's disorder. Francis brought the children after them, one on either side of her, and behind the whole little procession came Mr. Briar, a maid with fresh coal scuttle forgotten in her hands, and the great hound himself, who had already taken up his station by the nursery door, as if he understood that witnesses mattered now. The corridor received them with no pretense. The cracked mirror still stood uncovered. The little traveling clock on the side table ticked in plain hearing. Farther along, the newly wound clock in the morning room answered it with a steadier beat. No one could mistake the fact of change. Neither could anyone mistake how recent it was. Owen stopped between those two sounds and faced the gentleman. "You will observe," he said, "that my cousin's petition is not wholly false. This house has been misgoverned by grief. I permitted customs to continue that had become injurious to my children and absurd to my servants. I withdrew from duties I ought not to have laid down." He spoke each admission without ornament. "That is true." Mr. Gresham, who had perhaps expected denial or temper, looked faintly disordered by candor. Dr. Marden's expression gentled. Owen went on. "What is also true is that I have resumed them. The clocks are being wound. The children's rooms are reopened. The household is under direction again. My son and daughter are no longer kept from me by my own weakness." He glanced toward Julian and Eliza then, and there was pain in it, but no evasion. "I do not ask you to ignore what I failed to do. I ask you to see what I am doing now." That, in its grave plainness, did more work than any eloquence could have done. Mr. Gresham cleared his throat. "A house may be tidied in haste, Your Grace." "Yes," Owen said, "a charade may." "This is not a charade." He turned and walked the remaining few paces to the nursery threshold. Bran did not stir when he came, only looked up once and laid his head down again upon his paws. Beyond him the nursery stood open to the cold light, aired now, dust disturbed, the stale ribbons partly removed. But at the far inner arch, before the alcove where the cradle stood, one last breadth of black crepe remained. Mr. Gresham saw it at once. "So that is the center of it," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Dr. Marden said quietly, "Can you bring yourself to alter that room further, sir?" The question was fair. That made it merciless. Francis felt Eliza's fingers tighten around hers. Julian held his breath. Mr. Briar lowered his eyes. The whole house seemed to gather in that pause, in the ticking clocks, the cold nursery air, the smell of old ashes waiting in the grate. Owen did not answer at once. He stepped into the room, past Bran, past the little mantel clock that had struck of its own accord, and came to stand before the final strip of mourning cloth. Then he turned, not to the gentleman, but to Francis. "Will you stay?" he asked. And before anyone in that room could decide what precisely he meant by the question, he reached up for the last of the crepe. He did not answer her with words. Owen caught the hanging strip of black crepe in his hand and tore it free from the arch in one long motion. The cloth came down with a dry whisper and fell across the nursery floor at Bran's feet. No thunder followed. No one cried out. Only the clocks went on ticking, one in the corridor, one in the morning room, and the faint little nursery one recovering itself by fits and starts upon the mantel. Then the Duke crossed to the grate. The hearth had been laid earlier by a servant, obeying habit more than hope, a few sticks and coals set ready but untouched. Owen knelt before it in his dark coat, oblivious of ash on the knee and soot against his wounded hand. Mr. Gresham opened his mouth, perhaps to object to the impropriety of such theater before witnesses, but Dr. Marden laid a quiet hand upon his sleeve. Some acts are not theater when they cost the doer dearly enough. Owen struck flint, once, twice, a third time. The tinder caught with a small orange pulse. He bent and breathed upon it. A thread of smoke rose. Then a little flame took hold of the kindling and ran along the wood. Warmth began where there had been only memory. Eliza gave a sob that turned into laughter in the same breath. Julian looked as if something tight across his chest had at last been cut loose. Bran lifted his head and watched the fire as though approving a long-delayed correction. Owen stood and faced the gentleman. There was soot on his fingers and grief still in his face, but it no longer made a ruin of him. "You wish to know whether I can govern this house," he said. "I could not. For a time I could not, that is the truth. But I do now, and I shall. My children remain with me, my household remains mine. If further proof is required, you may have my accounts, my tenants, my physicians, my servants, and my own admission besides. You shall not have my son and daughter as prizes for another man's convenience." Mr. Gresham, who had seen enough rooms and enough families to recognize the difference between performance and return, bowed his head. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the trustees will be satisfied a response has been made in proper person." Dr. Marden's expression softened altogether. "And in better health than rumor allowed." When they had gone, when Mr. Brier had wept privately in a passage and the children had been sent at last to bed with cheeks flushed from tears and heat, Owen remained in the nursery doorway while Bran slept before the revived fire. Frances had turned to leave, thinking the night had asked enough of them both, when he said her name. Not Mrs. Vale. Frances. She stopped. "I asked whether you would stay," he said. The old reserve was still there, but changed now into something steadier than pride. "I did not mean for the hour or for the hearing. I mean here, in this house, with the children, with me. Not as a servant kept for usefulness, but as the Lady of Wraywood, if you can forgive what poor welcome I gave you. There are proposals born of fever, and there are proposals born of seeing clearly at last what one cannot afford to lose. This was the latter." Frances looked past him to the hearth newly lit, to Bran's great body at peace on the rug, to the little nursery clock trembling on toward its next minute. "Yes," she said. By morning, the frost on the nursery windows had thinned to clear drops, and one warm line had opened through it where the new fire had held all night. Later, in the corridor, the children's laughter came and went with the ordinary creak of floorboards, and no one hurried to hush it. If this story found a place with you, you're welcome to leave a note below and stay for the next one.